There is something deeply confusing to an avoidant when the person they expected to chase them suddenly becomes still, not cold, not cruel, just still. They pull back and nothing dramatic happens. No long message, no emotional collapse, no panic trying to close the distance, just quiet strength, and that quiet changes the whole game. Because most avoidants are used to a certain pattern. They step back, the other person leans in, they go silent, someone else fills the silence, they create distance, and the other person works even harder to prove love. That pattern gives them a hidden sense of control. It lets them believe connection can stay alive on their terms, with their distance, with their timing, with their walls still standing. But then one day, they meet someone different, someone warm, someone deeply feeling, someone kind, someone who really sees them. And still, this person does not run after them. This person cares, but they stay grounded. They love, but they do not beg. They stay open, but they do not disappear inside the connection. And if you have ever seen that shift happen, then you already know this is where everything starts to turn. Because what feels small on the outside becomes huge on the inside. And what happens next is the part nobody talks about. Stay with me, because this is where the emotional power moves. The empath in this kind of dynamic is not emotionless. That is what makes it so powerful. They feel everything. They notice the change in tone. They sense the pause in reply. They can feel distance before it is spoken. But instead of reacting with fear, they respond with self-respect. That is the difference. They do not confuse love with self-erasure. They do not think caring means chasing. They do not turn empathy into over-functioning. So when the avoidant pulls away, the empath does not perform desperation to prove the bond is real. They remain present but centered, soft but solid, open-hearted yet anchored inside themselves. For the avoidant, this is deeply unsettling because it breaks the script they know by heart. They expect withdrawal to create more emotional investment. They expect silence to create anxiety. They expect inconsistency to keep the other person hooked. But now they are facing someone whose emotional state is not controlled by their distance. That is rare. That is confronting. And that is why this kind of presence hits harder than dramatic pursuit ever could, because it says something without saying much at all. I can care about you and still keep my balance. I can love you and still honor myself. I can stay warm without handing over my peace. And when that message lands, even quietly, the avoidant feels it. Not always in words, not always right away, but they feel the ground under the dynamic begin to shift. Avoidant patterns often survive through imbalance. One person reaches, the other retreats. One over-explains, the other withholds. One becomes emotionally responsible for both people, while the other keeps distance and calls it space. That imbalance creates a kind of emotional leverage. The avoidant stays in the position of control because the other person keeps trying to restore closeness at any cost. But when the empath stops chasing, the imbalance begins to disappear. Suddenly, withdrawal no longer creates power. Distance no longer guarantees emotional access. Silence no longer gets rewarded with deeper devotion. And that is where uncertainty enters the avoidance world. They begin to wonder if this person may actually walk away. They begin to feel that the love being offered is real, but it is not endless under disrespect. That matters, because people often remember not the loudest connection, but the clearest one. Not the most chaotic, but the one that carried both warmth and boundaries at the same time. The empath who keeps chasing may be loving, yes, but their chase can accidentally reassure the avoidant that the dynamic will keep bending in one direction. The empath who stays steady without pursuit communicates something much stronger. My care is real, but so is my boundary. My heart is open, but it is not available for mistreatment. That kind of message lingers. It stays in the nervous system. It keeps echoing long after the moment itself has passed. And this is where it gets even more interesting. What unsettles the avoidant is not intensity, it is calm. Most of the time, when people deal with emotional unavailability, they become more anxious, more reactive, more demanding. That reaction then confirms the avoidant's private belief that closeness equals pressure, expectation, and loss of freedom. So they retreat more, not always because they do not feel, but often because they feel too much without knowing how to process it. Now place a different kind of empath in that same space. This person notices the distance, but they do not spiral. Communication becomes inconsistent, but they do not rush to chase validation. They do not instantly assume rejection and abandon themselves trying to fix the mood. They pause, they observe, they stay with their own center. Their steadiness changes the emotional atmosphere completely because the avoidant expects escalation. What they meet instead is emotional self-regulation. No guilt games, no dramatic threats, no attempt to force openness. Just a quiet kind of accountability that says, without anger, I will not join a pattern that requires me to lose my stability. That message feels safe to the avoidant nervous system because it is not attacking them, but it also feels exposing because for once their withdrawal is being witnessed clearly, not absorbed, excused, or chased away. And clarity, when it is calm, is harder to escape than conflict. Avoidants often carry inner stories that protect their distance. They tell themselves people are too demanding. Closeness is too much. The other person always wants more than feels safe. Sometimes those stories come from real pain. Sometimes they come from years of emotional self-protection. But when a grounded empath enters the picture, those old stories stop fitting so neatly. Why? Because this person is not flooding them, not pressuring them, not turning every pause into a crisis. They are simply consistent in who they are, and consistency creates pressure of its own, not aggressive pressure, honest pressure. The avoidant starts noticing something uncomfortable. Their usual strategies are no longer working the same way. Pulling back does not trigger chaos. Silence does not create panic. Emotional distance does not produce endless reassurance. Instead, it produces calm evaluation. It produces space. It produces reality. And reality begins to mirror their behavior back to them. That mirror effect is powerful, because once the avoidant sees that they are dealing with someone emotionally self-contained, someone who cannot be controlled through inconsistency, something begins to shift. Maybe not outwardly at first, maybe not in words, but internally they begin to feel the difference between connection built on emotional dependence and connection built on emotional maturity. One feels easy to manage from a distance, the other feels impossible to control, and that second kind stays with them. What leaves the deepest mark is not pressure, it is clean emotional presence. Think about that. Most people, when they connect with someone unavailable, start adjusting themselves. They become more performative, more anxious, more eager to secure closeness. They get louder emotionally because they are afraid the connection might slip away. But the empath in this dynamic does something else. They do not shrink their heart, but they also do not distort themselves to stay close. They listen without overreaching. They care without collapsing. They show up without surrendering their center. That combination creates emotional imprint, because what the avoidant experiences is not demand, but ease, not performance, but authenticity, not emotional noise, but steady presence. And presence like that is rare. It creates a new category in the avoidant mind. Closeness no longer automatically equals pressure. For a moment, maybe for the first time in a long time, closeness feels like it might actually be safe. That shift is subtle, but it is profound. Even if the avoidant later steps back or leaves, the nervous system remembers what happened there. The body remembers being seen without being cornered, being understood without being pushed, being cared for without someone trying to emotionally consume them. That memory becomes a reference point. And once that reference point exists, ordinary connections can start to feel flatter, louder, or less real by comparison. This is why some connections do not leave cleanly. The avoidant may move on the surface. They may act fine. They may tell themselves it was not that serious, not that deep, not the right fit. But something does not fully reset because the connection did not feed their defenses. It bypassed them. It touched something underneath. The empath created recognition. The avoidant felt seen in a way that did not feel invasive. That matters more than most people realize. Being seen without being chased softens defenses without activating resistance. It opens emotional awareness without forcing emotional surrender, and that is why the memory stays alive. Human beings do not forget environments where they felt both safe and understood at the same time. Those moments become emotional benchmarks. They settle into the background of the mind as a standard. So later, when the avoidant meets dynamics that feel too intense or too shallow, they unconsciously compare them to that one experience that felt clean, not perfect, not fantasy, just emotionally coherent. And that is what creates longing, not always longing for the person in a direct way, but longing for the state that person created. The calm, the clarity, the kind of love that did not pull, push, chase, or trap. That is the imprint. And once it exists, distance does not always erase it. Sometimes distance makes it louder because absence removes distraction and leaves only the emotional truth behind. Now, let's go deeper, because this is the turning point many people miss. The empath often starts the connection as the one holding the emotional weight. They understand the silences, they interpret mixed signals, they give the benefit of the doubt again and again. They stay longer than most would because they can sense potential beneath the behavior. That does not make them weak. It means they are deeply attuned. But eventually something changes. They begin to realize that love without reciprocity is not depth. It is depletion. That realization is huge, and when it arrives, the shift is not always dramatic. It is often quiet. They stop filling every emotional gap. They stop translating distance into excuses. They stop treating inconsistency like a puzzle they must solve. They stop proving their devotion through exhaustion. Instead, they begin to create boundaries that are not harsh but clear. Boundaries that say, directly or indirectly, I will not continue living inside uncertainty just because I care. For the avoidant, this is a serious change in the emotional field, because boundaries introduce structure where they were used to fluid access. Structure means the relationship can no longer stay undefined forever. Structure means behavior has consequence. And consequence, when it is calm, can feel far more intense than open conflict. Because conflict can be dismissed as drama, calm boundaries cannot. They do not shout, they do not attack. They simply define reality. And reality is exactly what avoidant patterns often work so hard to keep blurred. Once boundaries enter the dynamic, everything becomes more visible. Silence is no longer neutral. It means something. Distance is no longer harmless. It has weight. Inconsistency is no longer endlessly absorbed by the other person's patience. It is reflected back as a real strain on connection. That reflection creates discomfort in the avoidant because now they are no longer interacting with someone who adapts forever. They are dealing with someone who can actually step back. And stepping back changes the emotional value of everything. What was once assumed to always be there now becomes something that can be lost, not as a tactic, not as manipulation, simply as the natural result of self-respect. This is where emotional consequence begins to register. The avoidant may start to notice the absence of easy access. They may start to miss the steady warmth that once felt guaranteed. They may begin to reconsider the patience, care, and understanding they had quietly depended on. And that recognition often does not come during the heat of the dynamic. It comes later, in space, in silence, in the moments where the old emotional safety net is no longer there. That is when attention sharpens. That is when certain memories return with new meaning. That is when questions begin to form inside them. What was this connection really worth? Did I take it for granted because it was steady? What did their presence actually give me? Those questions do not always lead to instant change, but they do create awareness. And awareness is the first crack in any old pattern. There is a truth here that hits hard. People do not always value what they receive endlessly without structure. They value what they finally realize could disappear. But in this dynamic, that realization is not being manufactured. The empath is not threatening to leave in order to gain control. They are simply refusing to stay available under conditions that break them down. That choice creates a form of emotional gravity. It is not loud, it is not dramatic, it is not revenge, it is alignment. The empath begins to be present when presence is mutual and less available when it is not. They stop offering endless emotional access to someone who will not meet them with steadiness. And once that line is held, the energy recalibrates. The avoidant can feel it, even if they never say it, even if they act unaffected. Something is different now. The dynamic no longer stretches endlessly to absorb their distance. It responds. If they withdraw, the connection does not magically deepen through longing. It stabilizes or reduces. If they engage, warmth grows naturally. If they stay inconsistent, uncertainty increases. This is not punishment. It is simply reality reflecting behavior, and that reflection can be very confronting for someone used to love remaining available no matter how little they participate, because now they must face something simple and hard. Connection is not self-sustaining without mutual effort, and once that truth is felt, it cannot be fully unfelt. What makes the empath unforgettable is not that they gave the most, it is that they finally chose themselves without closing their heart. That combination is rare. Many people can love deeply, fewer can love deeply while staying aligned with their own values. The empath matures when they realize emotional depth is not proven by how much pain they can tolerate. It is proven by how well they can stay connected to themselves while loving someone else. That is a powerful shift. They are still compassionate, still understanding, still able to see the fear behind avoidance. But now they are no longer willing to let that understanding become a reason to betray themselves. They can recognize withdrawal without chasing it. They can see distance without filling it. They can care without turning care into dependency. From the avoidance side, this is deeply unfamiliar. They are no longer dealing with someone who reacts to every change in mood. They are no longer dealing with someone who overfunctions emotionally to keep the bond alive. They are no longer dealing with someone who stays accessible under every condition. Instead, they are facing someone emotionally available, yet no longer reachable through inconsistency. That is the part that changes everything, because it breaks the expectation that distance will automatically create pursuit. It replaces old emotional leverage with truth, and truth has a different weight. It removes excuses, it removes confusion, it makes patterns visible, and once patterns are visible, the old comfort of ambiguity starts to disappear. And that visibility creates a strange kind of inner pressure for the avoidant, not because the empath is forcing growth, but because their calm presence leaves fewer places to hide. When there is no emotional chaos to point at, no dramatic reaction to blame, no pleading to dismiss, behavior becomes more obvious. Silence becomes honest, choices become meaningful, absence becomes harder to explain away. The avoidant may begin to sense that they are no longer being met by a system that endlessly compensates for their inconsistency. They are being met by someone who has stopped confusing patience with sacrifice, someone who is no longer trying to win love by enduring imbalance. That is where accountability enters, and accountability can feel intense when a person is used to controlled distance. But this is not the kind of accountability that comes with accusation. It comes with contrast. The contrast between a dynamic built on emotional instability and one built on emotional coherence. That contrast lingers. It becomes a private reference point in the mind. There was someone who could care without collapsing, someone who could love without chasing, someone who could step back without bitterness, someone who stayed warm but would not stay lost. That kind of experience quietly reshapes what connection means. It creates a new internal standard, even if the avoidant cannot fully admit it yet. And once that standard exists, every future connection is measured against it, whether consciously or not. Here is the part many people need to hear clearly. The empath's power does not come from becoming colder. It does not come from games. It does not come from withholding love to trigger a reaction. Real power comes from refusing to abandon yourself for access. That is a very different thing. It is not a tactic, it is maturity. The empath stops trying to secure connection through depletion. They stop proving worth through overgiving. They stop turning pain into evidence that the bond is special. Instead, they begin to live by a new truth. Love should not require disintegration to survive. Once that truth settles in, the whole emotional posture changes. They no longer beg for clarity, they become clear. They no longer demand consistency while tolerating chaos. They become consistent with themselves. They no longer wait for permission to honor their own needs. They honor them. That self-choosing is transformative because it refines how love is allowed to exist in their life. It says, I can feel deeply and still leave what is not aligned. I can care and still say no. I can understand your wounds and still protect my peace. That is not hardness. That is integrity. And integrity leaves a stronger imprint than intensity ever will, because intensity can be forgotten as drama. Integrity gets remembered as truth. If this is hitting home, keep listening, because the final lesson is the one that changes everything. In the end, what truly shakes the avoidant is not being demanded more from. It is meeting someone who no longer needs to chase in order to be real, someone whose love stands instead of begging, someone whose care is steady but not endlessly available under disrespect, someone who shows that connection can be warm, clear, mutual, and honest all at once. That kind of person becomes unforgettable, not because they fought the hardest to stay, but because they stayed true while they were there. And when alignment was gone, they did not destroy themselves trying to keep proximity. They stepped back with dignity. They reclaimed their energy. They let reality speak. And reality, once felt, changes people. Maybe slowly, maybe silently, but it changes them. The avoidant may not transform overnight. They may still resist. They may still retreat. But somewhere inside, a mirror has been placed. A standard has been set. They have now felt what it is like to be loved without pressure and met without performance. They have seen what calm boundaries look like. They have experienced the difference between devotion and self-loss. That memory does not disappear easily. And for the empath, the final lesson is just as important. The strongest love is not the one that stays at any cost. It is the one that stays without losing itself and leaves when staying starts to require self-betrayal. The moment you stop betraying yourself to keep someone close, you step out of the old pattern for good. And that is where real emotional power begins.